Well, good afternoon. This is what we like to see at the beginning of the term, a full house. I apologize to those who don't have seats. There is an overflow room, and at some point some official person will tell us that there's a problem, but that won't be me. So anyway, welcome. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I'm delighted to have you here for this year's Mary and Peter Dallman Class of 51 Great Issues Lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Stephen Kotkin of Princeton today. Professor Bill Walforth will do the honors of formally introducing Professor Kotkin, but I wanted to add my personal thanks to him for coming to Hanover for this occasion, although it is beautiful outside now, and I want to thank all of you for coming to the lecture on an afternoon like this. It wasn't so beautiful yesterday at various stops along his route. He had to fight off fog at several different junctures on his way to dispelling the fog here. So I really want to thank him for not saying the hell with it after repeated flight delays or cancellations. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Dallmans again, and particularly Professor Mary Dallman for her strong support of this subject and this lecture. William Faulkner famously wrote in one of his novels, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." That notion is at the heart of our thinking about this lecture and the series of 5 other events that will be presented this fall to commemorate the Centennial of 1917. This series of events is being sponsored by the Dickey Center together with the Leslie Center for the Humanities, the Political Economy Project, and the Departments of History, Government, Russian, and Film and Media Studies. And I think it's fair to say that all the sponsors agree that that the extraordinary events of 1917, the Russian Revolution, America's entry into World War I, had profound and enduring effects on the course of history and on the shaping of our world of 2017. And what's more, as we have entered a period of sudden, surprising, and unnerving fluidity, when international structures and arrangements seem much less assured than just a year or two ago, and at a time when we see worrisome hints that the world may be reverting to earlier, perhaps less congenial norms of international politics, it's time for a reconsideration of that earlier period when another seemingly stable world came rapidly and disastrously undone. The past is never dead, but it is sometimes overlooked, forgotten, or ignored, and that's why we thought it was so important to take a break from our usual programming on the issues of the day and to go further upstream to explore events that lie far beyond the challenges we face today. So in this centennial year, we thought it was time to think anew about the First World War, or the Great War as it was long known, to reconsider our nation's own halting rise to become a global military, political, and economic power, and to understand how much is at stake today amid the agitation in our politics for a different kind of global role. We also need to turn back to the October Revolution, which ultimately redrew global politics, creating a fundamental opposition between the capitalist West and this new and fearsome communist behemoth, an opposition that would define international affairs from 1945 to 1989, and whose reverberations are again being strongly registered in the tensions we feel today. So that's where we will start with Professor Kotkin's lecture, and with a focus on these pivotal events. In the next 6 or so weeks, we'll look at such diverse topics as the revolution in aesthetics brought about by 1917, the experience of African Americans in the war, and the experience of Dartmouth, our own institution, during that period. George Kennan, surely one of the wiser observers of public events in his time, wrote in his memoirs that he came to see, quote, "The First World War is the great seminal catastrophe of this century, the event which lay at the heart of the failure and decline of this Western civilization." Whether you accept Kennan's verdict or not, that Western civilization failed in his time, I think we can all agree that these events demand a revisiting, especially in this centennial year. And I hope you enjoy today's lecture, and I sincerely hope you will join us again for the coming events. And with that, I yield to Professor Walforth.
My name is Bill Wolfe. I'm a professor in the Department of Government here, teaches international relations, and as I stand before you, there's 2 things that are very evident to me. One is that you're not here to listen to me, and the sooner I get the hell off of the stage and away from this mic, the happier we'll be. And the second is that the remarkable biography and impressive accomplishments of Stephen Kotkin are available to you a tap of your phone or a click of your mouse away. You don't need me to go over them. The only thing I can do, I think, in the second, a few seconds of your time that I'll take standing up here is to try to tell you, if you don't already know, you're here, so you must think that it's worth listening to Stephen Kotkin. Maybe some of you even read some of his numerous award-winning and highly influential books. Maybe some of you have made a start on and finished his first of the 3 volumes of the Stalin biography that he's now making his obsession and current life's work. But if you haven't, why should you come here and hear this particular intellectual tell you about a subject as big as a war, a revolution, socialism, war, which is a title that obviously is telling you he's going to connect these events of 1917 to the big themes of the 20th century. And I'll just tell you in a nutshell why I think you should be here. It's because here at Dartmouth, one of the things we really try to talk with about our students is the difference between opinion and even clever opinion, even opinion that's really smart and clever, and opinion that rests upon fundamental, deep digging, research, and thought. And the person who's going to come speak to you today has indeed that cleverness and that smartness and that quickness that we like to see in our pundits and our public intellectuals. But in contrast to most of those you read in your daily news feed, the judgments he's about to tell you, you may agree with him or not, the judgments he's about to convey to you about these big themes rest on prodigious, fundamental, deep-digging, hardcore empirical research. Just to give you an empirical example of that, the first of his projected 3 volumes of his Stalin biography is 700 pages in length, has 200 pages of footnotes and bibliography, which are in 3 columns. Now, that's kind of a stupid way of putting it, but I'm trying to convey you quickly that the guy who's about to come up here knows what he's talking about. So I encourage you all, when you have the occasion, to Google him, and then you can see the things that a normal introducer would have told you about him. But why don't you just now listen to him and see if I'm right? So please join me in welcoming Stephen Kotkin from Princeton University.
Thank you, Director Benjamin, for the honor of the invitation. Thank you, Professor Wolfe, in our 33rd year of acquaintance. We met, obviously, when you were very young.
So are you.
And welcome, Big Green. This is my second visit. It's not often that I'm re-invited after a first visit, so I'm pleased as hell to be here. And it was hell that I crossed to get here. It turns out that, just as in New York, when we have a half-inch of snow and the airports all close, here in Boston, or not here, but close by in Boston, you have a little bit of fog and the airport closes. And it turns out the fog goes and then comes back, which is also interesting when you're at the airport all day. Anyway, let's try to have a lecture. I'm going to do my best now. The subject is enormous. The expectations, unfortunately, have been raised beyond a reasonable level. And so now success seems improbable to me. But I'm going to try. If some of this is familiar to you, I apologize because you may have read some of my works, although some of it is in the forthcoming work that's coming out on Halloween, the 2nd volume of the Stalin book. So, let's begin with Geopolitics 101. Well, Geopolitics 101 goes as follows. There was a struggle for preeminence between the French and the British that took place over 100 years and culminated in a British victory around 1815 when Napoleon was defeated. This was very improbable because the French had a larger economy, a greater population, a much larger state, but nonetheless the British won this competition with the French. It was a 100 years war that wasn't a war every single year, but over the course of about a century there was a lot of war, and as I said, the British won. This created the British-dominated world. The British then went on to create a global economy It was a British-led global economy. They were responsible for the vast majority of trade. Most transactions took place in sterling, and I could go on and give you all the facts about the British-dominated world. The French were still a major power, but it was clear who was the major power. And then two things happened in this British-dominated world. One was Bismarck's unification of Germany, which was an eruption on the continent in the 1870s, which created now what would become a great continental power. Germany went on right after the unification to have a spurt of industrialization, which was geared to higher end, high value industrialization at the time, chemical industry, engineering industry, precision instruments. It was breathtaking what the Germans achieved in the second half of the 19th century. So the game had changed. It was still a British-dominated world, but the Germans were on the rise and were letting everybody know that. They had tremendous aspirations. The other thing that happened also around this time period was the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Now, the Meiji Restoration in Japan didn't create a new state like Bismarck's unification of Germany did. There was already a Japanese state, but it significantly re-energized the Japanese state and led them also on a path of self-conscious modernization, industrialization, acquisition of higher level industries, and global aspirations, power aspirations. I could talk also about the victory of the North in the Civil War, which happened just a little bit before this, which also changed the course of history because it didn't destroy, but undermined the slaveholding agrarian empire of the South, which was significantly more wealthy than the North at the time of the Civil War, and produced instead a trajectory of the Northern manufacturing industry that we came to know of the United States power, which was already the largest economy in the world, certainly by 1900, but probably by the 1880s, but not yet a global player. Even though only about 5% of US GDP came from global trade in 1900, even though it was the largest economy in the world. So that's looming over the international system, but the big pieces are Bismarck or Germany and Meiji Japan. And you'll notice that those two new powers, new in the sense of not necessarily new countries, but only in one case, but new in the sense of being a great power player, right? They happen to border the Russian Empire. One is on one side of the Russian Empire, one's on the other side of the Russian Empire. So this not only fundamentally transformed the entire world in geopolitics, but also impinged on Russian Empire directly. Because now Russia had borders not with hundreds of small German states, but with the Wilhelmine Empire. And it also had the border with the Japanese in East Asia, where Russia was much weaker, but also had aspirations. So this process, right, this is sort of geopolitics 101. This is the world in which 1914 to 1918 war is going to take place, and the 1917 revolution is going to take place. Let's add the second piece. There's two pieces here. Let's add the second piece, and that's the theory of modernization as a geopolitical process. Modernization is not a sociological process. You don't move from traditional society to a modern society. What happens is a country that is very powerful has steel, ships made of steel, engineers, trained officers, universities, and I could go on. And they show up at your door uninvited. And they tell you, you know what? We're in charge now. We've decided to run your country. We've decided to take your natural resources. You're our colony now. This is known as imperialism. If you don't want to fall under the boot of those powerful countries, you must match them. You must have the ships that they have, and therefore the steel that they have. And you must have the engineers that they have, and you must have the officers that they have. This is what the Meiji Restoration was about. They sent a group of people on a global mission to examine the school systems, the banking systems, the officer corps. It was like a supermarket. They went shopping. Oh, the Belgian banking system. Oh, the Prussian officer corps. And on it went, right? So this is modernization. Modernization is a geopolitical process where the powerful countries can impose their will on you unless you can match them, their modern attributes. And the modern attributes are not only technological or economics, they are also, for example, cultural. A unified polity, a political system in which people are willing to participate in a grand enterprise. Mass politics, right? Mass culture. In any case, this modernization doesn't always take place. Some countries are incapable of meeting this challenge. And if they're not lucky geographically to be far away or to have no natural resources that could be interesting to the great powers, they then get caught up in this process. So we have these two things going on. One is the British-dominated world, in which Bismarck unifies Germany and the Meiji Restoration happens, which transforms the nature of the game. And then we have the game itself, which is compete with the greatest powers in the attributes that they have or fall under their boot. So this is what we sometimes call modern history. That's the definition of modern history. Now, this modern history will lead us into 1914, into the Great War. And I could give you all sorts of stories about the Great War. I'm sure you'll be hearing them throughout the course of this series and this year. Just one thing I want to focus on here in the interest of time. Nobody ever sleepwalks into war. The sleepwalking thesis on war, which you may hear again this year because it's a perennial, it can't be defeated. You can't bring facts to defeat the sleepwalker thesis of war because the sleepwalker thesis of war is close to people's hearts. It's about how war is unnecessary, how war is a mistake, how war is avoidable except we don't perceive that we're sleepwalking to it. Then you get into the archives, and you start to see several hundred orders to move horses into place before war breaks out. Several hundred just to move horses. And then there are several hundred orders just to move the hay that the horses are going to eat. And you say to yourself, how can you sleepwalk into war if over the course of many years you've been issuing orders about the horses and the hay? This is just the horses and the hay. We haven't gotten to the weapon systems, which take many years to produce. Right? Weapons is first you got to create the weapons industry, then you got to put the orders in, then you got to produce all of that. Then there's something called universal conscription. You got to decide that everyone of a certain age, certain gender is going to be a soldier. And you go into the archives and you see nothing but decisions being made towards war. And somehow this is known as sleepwalking towards war. There was no sleepwalking to World War I. There was only preparation for war. There was nothing but incessant preparation to war because the leaders who were in decision-making positions thought that there were gains to be had from war. The British developed a plan before the war broke out to destroy Germany economically. Yeah. There was a British plan. Usually the Germans are blamed for planning the war in the first place, and the British were supposedly just reactive. But it was the British who completed and the cabinet approved a war plan to destroy Germany financially and economically. And this plan went into action. It was approved, as I said, but the United States, when it got wind of it, said no. Because the British said we can contain the collateral damage, because if we're going to destroy Germany economically and financially, there's going to be destruction of British and, by the way, American firms. And the Americans said, you're nuts. We're not doing this. You're crazy. And the British pulled back, and that's when the blockade was introduced. The blockade of Germany was the fallback position of British economic warfare. British economic warfare was the nuclear option, and the blockade was a much lesser option than that. So they were just going to starve the Germans to death instead. Now, you've also heard about the Schlieffen Plan, for example, which was a supposed invention of German general to have a wheeling motion first into France and knock them out of the war and then take Russia on. And you go into the archives. Anybody read the Schlieffen Plan? Anybody here read the Schlieffen? It's in every single textbook. The Schlieffen Plan is a couple of pages long. It would take me only about 3 minutes or so to read it out loud. And it was found in the private archives of the Schlieffen family. It was not in the German War Ministry archives. And there is, in fact, no Schlieffen Plan. I know you don't believe me, but go out and read it. Go get it. Go online, read the Schlieffen Plan. Not the books about it, not the textbooks about World War I, but the actual document itself. I've read the British Economic Warfare Plan, which is very substantial and detailed. And I've read the Schlieffen Plan, which was a sketch written in the budget battles inside Germany and had no consequence in terms of war planning. There were no war plans attached to the Schlieffen Plan because the Schlieffen Plan wasn't even in with the war plans. And so, once again, these are just facts, and facts are never powerful enough vis-a-vis theories about war and what we want to believe. I open this only up as a parenthesis that the world system and the great powers were predicated on fighting war because there were advantageous dimensions seen in war. What happened, however, was the war proved catastrophic, unbelievably catastrophic. By the standards of anticipation. They didn't anticipate a short war. That's also wrong. They anticipated not a short war, but a longer war. But nonetheless, the war was more catastrophic than they anticipated. The casualties were really high. Offense didn't work. The various technologies that were introduced didn't break the logjam. The Germans won the war on the Eastern Front, but then they lost the war on the Western Front, but they came very close to winning. In any case, the war was seen as a catastrophe. So the upshot of the international system, which was this British-dominated world in which Germany and Japan had risen, France was still a great power, right? And Russia was also a great power, not necessarily of the highest rank, but feeding both Britain and Germany before the war broke out. In any case, it didn't end well, right? This modernization, this geopolitical modernization process went badly. And so we then had a situation in which avoiding war became the predominant strategic goal of the powers, not repeating what they had just done. Because what they had just done didn't work. It was seen as a mistake, an error. Now, they blamed others besides themselves, right? They blamed Comey's letter. They blamed Russian interference. They blamed lots of different things except their own complicity in the outcome. This is human nature. I do this myself all the time, right? Especially for World War I guilt, for example. I blame everybody but myself over that. It's typical. So we're human. We're human beings. But nonetheless, avoiding war became the geostrategic choice of the great powers. However, something happened, which was an effective political entrepreneur. A political entrepreneur arose in this situation, galvanized opinion, and took over this Bismarckian great state of Germany. In fact, didn't take it over, was handed the state of Germany. Didn't win an election, never won a majority of seats. In the election just before becoming chancellor, had actually declined in the number of votes. But the traditional right handed power to the radical right for all sorts of reasons. Right? Hitler came to power legally, just as Mussolini had been handed power by the king a decade earlier. Anyway, so now we have someone who is proactively attempting to alter the settlement of World War I. There is a matter of deception about this, dissembling. We're not really trying. We're not revisionists. We just we're just looking for our just due. Right? The Germans, we were mistreated. We're paying all these reparations. We lost all these lands. We have all these peoples abroad. It's unfair. Right? In any case, there is proactive revision of the Versailles Treaty by now German power on the continent. And this is a problem for those looking to avoid war. So our usual story about this is in my view, doesn't comport with the facts all the time. And this is the way I would describe it. The British clung to the desire to avoid war at all costs. And that's because they had the most to risk. They had a global empire, which was very valuable to them. They had tremendous risk, and they also, British strategy is basically fighting everything on the cheap or getting others to fight the wars for you. Right? The British had a much cleverer strategy than the US has in this regard. Right? British grand strategy. Avoid, get others to do your fighting, or fight on the cheap. So the British wanted to avoid war at all costs. The French also wanted to avoid war at all costs because World War I had taken place where? In France. They won, and they were destroyed in winning. We're going to see this is going to happen in World War II. The winners are also going to be the places that are destroyed, like China and the Soviet Union. But in any case, so the French don't want to fight, and the British don't want to fight. Then there's the Soviet Union. Do they want to fight? What's their story in the interwar period? Now, Hitler wants German aggrandizement, and he's this political entrepreneur. And he's quite successful. You know, for example, if he had been run over by a car or died of a heart attack in 1938 or 1939, he would be considered a very successful statesman from the German point of view, and even beyond Germany. Of course, he didn't have a heart attack or get run over by a car in 1938-39. So the Soviet case is the more complicated one, because the Soviets had a policy of peace. We stand for peace, right? But in practice, people didn't interpret that way. So now I'm going to do the 1917 piece and put in this, a little more content to the Soviet thing, and then resume the story that I've been telling. So what happened in 1917? A lot happened, but what are the key things that we need to know, the big takeaways? And there are two big takeaways from 1917. One was anti-capitalism. This was an anti-capitalist revolution. Nobody knew exactly what socialism was because there had never been socialism. There had only been discussions of socialism and pamphlets about socialism and arguments about socialism, but there hadn't been any socialism in practice, right? So anti-capitalism, that's what socialism was going to be. If capitalism, for example, had markets, socialism couldn't have markets, they would have to have planning. If capitalism had, oh geez, I don't know, private property, socialism would have to have collective property, couldn't have private property. If capitalism had bourgeois parliaments, socialism couldn't have bourgeois parliaments, and on it went, right? So the anti-capitalist revolution is very, very significant. The second piece is anti-imperialism, right? There's a revolt against this colonial world that we're talking about. There's a revolt against Western power. Who assigned the West to take over the world? How come the West is forming all these colonies? And so you put together this anti-capitalism and the anti-imperialism is a very powerful concoction, and it's very successful. And there's a burst of tremendous chiliastic, millenarian, right, feeling, emotion, the possibility of a new world, the possibility of peace, as well as abundance and social justice. It's just astonishing, the level of emotion outpouring globally, not just in Russia, about this moment. It turns out, however, that when you eliminate private property markets, parliaments, judiciaries, and all the rest, you don't get freedom, abundance, social justice, self-determination. You get tyranny. You get tyranny, right? So it's a tragic ending. The quest is sincere. The problems it's addressing, like imperialism, war, are there. The injustices are real, but the solutions are considerably worse. Right? But what you get also is, it happens in the Russian Empire. It happens in what's now Soviet Eurasia. And here you got a story which is an identity which is part of Europe and part of Asia, but not at home in either. It's Eurasia, or it's Europe and Asia, or it's above Europe and Asia. It's a providential power. It's a special mission in the world. It's a country that's a civilization unto itself, right? So it's special in some way. And this specialness, which is deep in the Russian imperial culture, now takes the form of the anti-capitalism and the anti-imperialism. This gives a kind of scientific gloss to a deep and fundamental part of the political culture. So it has resonance even for people who are not socialists, but are Russian patriots, for example. It has resonance for people who are not socialists abroad, but are anti-imperialists. It has global resonance, much more so than, for example, the Islamic Republic today, Iranian Islamic Republic. That has some global resonance, but this stuff has real global resonance, much more widespread. Right? And at the same time, you have this, that you have the anti-capitalism and the anti-imperialism, which links up with fundamental structures of political culture in Russia, Eurasia, now Soviet Eurasia. At the same time as that, you have a similar dynamic as before with the domestic identity and relations to the West. So, for example, you have a non-Western, which could even be an anti-Western identity, which wants to be as good as the West or even better than the West, but different from the West. Right? It's this special, it's this providential, it's this Eurasia, but it's in relation to the West. And so it's a kind of alternative to the West, or it would like to be an alternative to the West. It's a self-styled alternative to the West. An alternative civilization and world order. So you put together the anti-capitalism and the anti-imperialism and the Russian political culture, and you get the quintessential security dilemma. The security dilemma is the Soviets claim to be for peace, but then you look at the facts of who they are, and they're anti-capitalist, they're anti-imperialist, they're anti-Western, and they're their own special civilization. They're an alternative global order. That's how they talk about themselves. So they talk about being for peace and talk about being an alternative global political order to the existing political order. So, I mean, if you're in the existing political order and someone telling you that they're an alternative to you, and in fact, if they practice anti-capitalism, I could talk also about the anti-imperialism, the invention of the Soviet Union, qua-union, and how this brilliant innovation, which was also done by Stalin, put the imperialism on the defensive, because it was a way to be imperialist while claiming not to be imperialist. An extremely successful instrument that the Soviets had. Anyway, so the other powers are kind of challenged because their security is now threatened, because the Soviet Union claims to be the future, the movement of history, an alternative to you. At the same time as it's talking about, being for peace. So what are you going to believe? You're going to believe the part that they're for peace, or you're going to believe the part that they are an alternative to you? And you've got Russian history, which has this defensive expansionism, where they say they're under threat, and so therefore they got to take over the territory next to them. Right? That's Russian history. And so here you are. And your response is going to be to worry about the Soviet Union as a threat. And you're worried about that even though the Soviets are claiming to be for peace. So you have the Hitler problem gets occluded by the Soviet story. The British and the French both want avoidance of war. Hitler is clearly pushing to revise the Versailles settlement, which would be at British and French expense. And the Soviet thing is claiming to be for peace, but is also an alternative global order, self-described, and therefore is creating this quintessential, what they call in social science, security dilemma for its neighbors and the other great powers. So that's the situation. And now we have these figures like Chamberlain, and Churchill, and others who are less household names like Daladier and then Mussolini and all of this. And so what happens in this picture? What happens in this picture? We're going to get to why there's a Second World War, right? I hope. That's where we're moving with this story. Right? Everybody saw that the First World War was not an accident. That's argument one. And the consequences of the First World War were nobody wanted the Second World War, but then somebody did want a Second World War, and that was Hitler. And that became a problem for dealing with the consequences of not wanting a Second World War, right? So I know this is a little abstract, but just give me a moment here. This may come together. This may be less disappointing soon than it is right now. I'm serious. Can't I be serious at least for a moment? Chamberlain, who does the Munich Pact and appeasement and has what we call a malodorous reputation and is beyond rehabilitation. Right? I mean, not to the extent that Hitler is beyond rehabilitation, but Chamberlain is. You say something nice about Chamberlain, and people are just going to snigger, and their opinion of you is going to go down even more than it is already, right? Well, what was Chamberlain's argument? Chamberlain's argument was, if I go into a deal with Stalin to fight Hitler, and we win, how do I then get Stalin out of the middle of Europe? You recognize that problem? I recognize that problem. That was Chamberlain's argument. Now, you can say that he was saying that argument, he was looking for excuses, rationales not to fight. He wanted to cut a deal, he wanted to believe Hitler, he was naive. All that stuff is partly true. This is not about Chamberlain's character. This is not about whether he was a funny-looking guy with the beak nose and the umbrella and the top hat talking about peace in our time after he handed over another country for free to Hitler, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what the actual choices were and what you could have done that was better. Moreover, the conservatives who criticized Chamberlain for his appeasement policy, they couldn't answer this question. Yeah, how do we then get communism out of Central Europe if this policy of teaming up with Stalin against Hitler is successful? So Chamberlain's colleagues had no answer. And moreover, the Labour Party didn't even think it was a problem. Oh, the Soviet Union and Central Europe, what's wrong with that? That would be a good outcome. I don't think it was a good outcome, but certainly a large part of the Labour Party was not only pro-appeasement of Hitler, because they didn't want to pay the costs either of fighting, because their constituents would have done the actual fighting, but they were appeasing Stalin as well, or even more, abetting Stalin. So that's the environment in which Chamberlain is acting. Once again, this is not an attempt to rehabilitate Chamberlain, who's beyond rehabilitation. It's just to show what the strategic choices were. Right? Believing that Hitler might keep to a deal versus facing the question of actually fighting a war with massive casualties and then having communism implanted in Europe. Right? Those were the choices that Chamberlain faced. Now, in the end, his choice doesn't look that good. But once again, the burden on us is to say not only what he did wrong, but what we could have done that was better. Okay. Now the French, what was the French position in this? The French position in this was, we live here. Like the British, they're on the other side of that channel. For the French, it was much more immediate. Right? The old joke, a fog in the channel, continent isolated. Right? For the British give the weather forecast. Fog in the channel, continent is now isolated. Well, yeah, the British had that. They had that channel. The French didn't have the channel. There was this border, and one side was France and the other side was Germany. And then there were these small countries at the top there, but they didn't have much buffer qualities in the First World War, and nobody thought they would again. So the French were hedging their bets. They were willing to do a deal with Stalin. They hated the guy. And Daladier was not favorably disposed towards the Soviet Union. He was the Chamberlain of France at the time. And the French establishment, and I could go on about how France was not that happy about this as their option. And in fact, French policy was not to do a serious deal with the Soviet Union, because once again, they didn't want to be in bed with the communists. Stalin was, after all, a murderer. The French wanted to attract the British to an actual alliance. And they thought that if they played around with the Soviets, that this might be able to draw the British towards the French. They did, to a certain extent, they got an entente or an understanding rather than a full-scale alliance, the British and the French. This was at least something that the French were able to extract from the British. But French grand strategy was get a deal with the British, and British grand strategy was avoid the war. So the Western powers have a certain paralysis here. Right? And then Stalin's policy, what's Stalin's policy in this particular equation? Well, Stalin is not necessarily aggressive like Hitler in proactively trying to revise the international system. But hey, if Hitler knocks everything over, someone's got to pick up some of the pieces, right? I mean, hey, if he's going to knock over everything, maybe we can get this piece and that piece and this piece and this piece, right? So Stalin has the quintessential, let the others bear the brunt of Hitler, but if there's anything that to be gained, any spoils to be gained, I'll be ready to pick them up. Okay, so this is in a war, sometimes known as, why did we get World War II argument. The reason we got World War II was because Hitler wanted World War II, but also because the Soviet Union, 1917, the Russian Revolution, is a massive contributing factor. And that's what I want to elaborate in a few more minutes before we go to the question period. So just to repeat, the argument, World War I is no accident. Avoiding World War II is reasonable, or trying to avoid World War II is reasonable. Being able to avoid World War II is impossible or very difficult because of Hitler. But the Soviet variable, that's the one that now we're going to focus a little bit on. Because the Soviet variable is the one that has scrambled things. It has scrambled the coalition against Hitler. It has scrambled the larger imperial question for both France and Britain. Right? And it's very difficult for them to understand, for them to look at, for them to perceive, for them to figure out, because it's an opaque political system, right? It's a dictatorship. It speaks in ways that seem propagandistic to foreigners. You don't know how decisions are made on the inside. And it's putting out a story that doesn't always correspond to what it's actually doing. It's got political parties that it controls inside your democratic parliaments. Yeah, there's a communist party in the French parliament. A communist party in a French parliament. And Stalin says the Communist Party should do X, and they do that. And they're inside the French democratic political system. So it has scrambled the picture in ways that we don't always appreciate fully when we make these justified critiques of the French and the British in the interwar period and what their genuine options might be. Now, I should do one more piece here before I finish off on the Soviet piece, and that's the Japanese piece, which is I left off, right? We had the Meiji Restoration. The Japanese were the other flanking power on the eastern side of the Soviet Union. And the Japanese have their own ambitions. And the Japanese ambitions are significantly impinging on the situation also. And they're left out of the story because usually we have Europeanists tell this fantastic story, right? And the East Asianists, they're like a different tribe. And they have their own books and their own journals and everything else. And their story is about, the rise of Japan, and then is Japan aggressive or not, and Japan confronting the United States and Pearl Harbor and all of this. Well, during the Hitler-Stalin Pact negotiations in August 1939, the Soviet Union and Japan are fighting a war. They're fighting a very significant war. We call it a border war because it's a border incident that triggers the war. Now, it's limited in the sense that it doesn't engage fully the entire armies of both countries, but we don't know that that's going to stay that way. It could well be that the Japanese decide that this is it. If you're sitting there in the Kremlin trying to figure out what's going on, you're focused not only on the European theater, but also on the East Asian theater. Moreover, for the British Empire, right, for the British Empire, you have tremendous exposure and vulnerability in East Asia. Right? There are these things called Hong Kong, Singapore, let alone British India, right? And all of that is potentially exposed to Japanese firepower. And so the Germans are trying to do a deal with the Japanese. The British are trying to figure out what to do with the Japanese. The Soviets are trying to figure out what to do with the Japanese. So the Japanese are another scrambling factor in the geopolitical picture of how we're going to get to World War II. All right. So once again, more could be said about each one of these pieces. But the larger argument I'm trying to make is that socialism itself is a very significant contributing factor to World War II. Now, I know this is not a popular argument, and I know that not everyone will agree with this argument. So maybe hear me out for, I think I got 5 more minutes before the Q&A. Is that correct?
Yep.
Am I good with that?
You're good with that.
All right. So this being Dartmouth and this being the Dickey Center, I went for a big picture talk, rightly or wrongly. But I hope that if need be, the big picture talk can be, I can substantiate it in all the instances with the facts as necessary if you want them in the question period. All right. So, we have an age-old debate about Stalin, whether he was after security or trying to expand to take over the world. Did he just want to protect himself? Was he defensive, or was he offensive? Was he after this kind of massive expansionism take over the world? And now I'm in the position of having read all the surviving documents that Stalin himself produced or signed or were written for him about these kind of questions. And so now I have a much better understanding of this question, which I remember was a big issue when we first met 33 years ago. Unresolved debate, still today. And I've come to the conclusion that Stalin, like I said, unlike Hitler, was not a proactive revisionist, but was much more of an opportunist, although he had a big appetite in the opportunism. If somebody was going to create the opportunities, he was going to seize them. He had a geopolitical theory. He invented his own geopolitical theory. In fact, the Socialism in One Country piece that he wrote, which was not about socialism in one country, was about socialism in one country first, because that's how history had happened. Should we build socialism in the one country in which it happened first on the way to socialism for the whole world? And the answer was, yeah, we're not going to give up the revolution of 1917. The socialism in one country first argument had been made by Lenin and had been made by Trotsky. And then it's made by Stalin. But Stalin created this, you wouldn't know, because we have this Trotsky critique of Stalin's socialism in one country, which is not based upon what Stalin wrote in Socialism in One Country, but is based upon what Trotsky said Stalin wrote in Socialism in One Country. So Stalin argued that imperialist war produced the possibility of revolution. Unlike the Leninist theory or the Marxist theory even more, where revolution was a product solely of class struggle, Stalin acknowledged that the war had been decisive and differentiated Russia from other cases. And this is why the working class, in his words, was more radical in the Russian case, because the war had radicalized the situation and made socialist revolution possible. And so therefore, socialist revolution was not going to happen in every case. But with imperialist war, if imperialist war were repeated as he expected it to repeat, then socialism was again a possibility. So there could be additional revolutions provided there was imperialist war, provided the imperialist war didn't destroy the Soviet Union in the process. See, that was the problem. You could want the imperialist war to give you more socialist revolution, but the imperialist war could give you the end of the socialist revolution in one country. Right? For example, Germany could destroy the Soviet Union. So the imperialist war was a dangerous, two-edged, be careful situation. Opportunity maybe, but danger also. So you needed an imperialist war to be directed at others. Right? You needed it to happen, for example, against the French and against the British or against anybody else, but not against you. But that was not so easy to do. So this is Stalin's machinations, right? The calculation that imperialist war is good, but also bad. The possibility that socialism could spread, but also could be destroyed. The fact that he wanted more revolution, but didn't want to lose the whole revolution in the process. So it's not as if it's because he's a cautious person by nature, right? Hitler is actually much more insane than Stalin in geopolitical terms, because Hitler doesn't calculate risk and reward the same way. Hitler is a gambler, a tremendous gambler, without calculating risk. He's much more like Lenin, Hitler, or Steve Bannon, for example, than he is like Stalin. Stalin is more calculating in his risk-taking less insane in the rest. I mean, he's just as big a mass murderer, don't get me wrong. He's a sociopath, but I'm just talking in the geopolitical terms. So he's got this geopolitical theory, and he's living this geopolitical theory. So it's all about trying to not fly too close to the sun, but fly close to the sun. That's Stalin's geopolitics in the interwar period. And that, of course, is what worries the French and the British, in addition to the other things they're worrying about. So the idea of them doing a deal with Stalin against Hitler at any point is very difficult to fathom. Let's add the fact that Stalin is murdering loyalists. It's very hard to know. Is that kind of person going to keep his word, for example? We all now look back in retrospect and say, Hitler, who thought Hitler would ever keep his word? But we're talking about Stalin keeping his word. Was that obvious that Stalin would keep his word? Was he the kind of guy that inspired trust? I have a chapter on the Finnish War and how Stalin tries to negotiate with the Finns short of war. And the Finns just don't believe that he's sincere. He's making these sincere offers of territorial exchange. You give me this, I can protect Leningrad, I'll give you this. He's offering more territory, square miles, in exchange for the territory he wants the Finns to cede to him. And the Finns don't trust him. They don't believe him. He's got a credibility gap with the Finns because he's Joe Stalin, and the other things that he's doing, right, diminish your desire to take him at his word. So this is a major contributing factor to the outbreak of World War II. In addition, Stalin does have significant appetites. You see, because when he begins to take advantage of the Hitler-Stalin Pact in August 1939, the Hitler-Stalin Pact in August 1939 allows Hitler to destroy Poland. And Stalin takes that piece of Poland, right? He takes the eastern piece of Poland as part of the deal. But then Hitler goes and fights his war in the West and beats France in 6 weeks, and we all know that story. But in the meantime, Stalin has decided to annex the Baltic states, annex Bessarabia and Bukovina from Romania, and these things are not granted by the pact with Hitler. These are steps that Stalin takes. Additionally, they don't say anything about, you can annex and create clone regimes. It says that they're predominant spheres in your interest. Your sphere is this sphere, but it doesn't say you can annex and create a clone regime. So Stalin's appetite begins to grow in this process of taking advantage when Hitler's delivering these things to him. And so his opportunism is very significant, but his opportunism is not driving the story. But it begins to drive the story in his fight vis-a-vis Hitler, right? So Hitler now, who is, we'll end with Hitler. Is that okay? We'll end with Hitler. I think I did the Stalin piece. I could do much more on the Stalin piece, but I want to end with the Hitler piece. So what the hell was Hitler doing? What was Hitler up to? If Stalin was this opportunism whose appetites grew in the eating, and Hitler provided the opportunity, if Stalin was the one who scared the French and the British legitimately, as he did with the Finns, he contributed to the destabilization and the onset of World War II, even though he didn't think he was doing that, right? What about the Hitler piece? And here, this is just a fantastic story. So Hitler believed in the master race theory. He believed that the German master race could only survive in a zero-sum world if it destroyed the other empires. It had a destroyed Jewry, of course, but it couldn't survive if the British Empire endured. Now, we think of this as, right? There was a lot of world to divvy up. Hitler won the Second World War. He had the entire continent either under his control or direct control or loyalists to him. There were only two neutral countries. The Soviet Union was observing the pact with Hitler, and Britain, across the Channel, had no beachhead on the European continent and no ability to cross and land on the continent and dislodge Hitler. So Hitler had won the Second World War as of 1941. You would think this would be enough, right? I mean, imagine, Napoleon hadn't achieved this. I wish I had brought a map to show you, but take my word for it. Hitler had won the Second World War, but it wasn't enough. And it wasn't enough because he believed in this master race, zero-sum, social Darwinist, right, idea, which meant that he had to prepare for a war to destroy the British Empire, which meant to destroy the Americans as well, because certainly the British would rely on the Americans would help the British out. And in the meantime, the Soviet Union had to be destroyed because he needed the resources to take on the global British Empire. So Hitler's grand strategy was to destroy the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. That's what he was preparing for. And you say to yourself, my God, that's insane. And that's why I say Stalin was not insane geopolitically. He had big appetites, but not this kind of big appetite. The idea that he would prepare for war to destroy Germany, Britain, and the United States simultaneously. Anyway, and then, of course, we had this Japanese thing that's eating at him. So in the end, right, in the end, as much as socialism is a contributing factor, as much as Stalin is a contributing factor, it's really this German thing. And so your understanding of the situation is, on the one hand, Hitler's personality, on the other hand, the structures that are in place, these moving structures that are in place, the geopolitics of the British-dominated world, the rise of Germany on the continent, the rise of Japan, the modernization where you're in this rivalry to keep up with the other great powers and the technologies and instruments that they have, the First World War catastrophe, right, and the consequences of that, the rise of socialism and socialism threat as an international order. The idea that the Second World War was somehow preventable, just like the First World War was a sleepwalker war, is very difficult for me to understand, given what I just laid out for you. It's preventable in what sense? Hitler is assassinated. There are multiple assassination attempts on Hitler, and they don't succeed, but they come very close. There's not a single assassination attempt against Stalin, not one. In all the years, in 3 decades of his power, there's not a single genuine, legitimate assassination attempt against Stalin. That's remarkable, right? But Hitler, there's sometimes 10, 11 in a single year assassination attempts against him. And in 38, just in November 38, they almost get him. Misses by just a few minutes. Anyway, so you can either blame the Hitler factor or, which is very significant, I'm not downplaying it, or you can see the structures that are in place here. Right? And then if you take the structural approach that I've now taken, which is very difficult to avoid the war that's coming for the reasons that I've laid out. If you take that structural approach, then you think about America and America's picture in this. Right? So America is looming on the international system and has never been responsible for it, a major player in it. There have been arguments that if the Americans had taken responsibility after World War I, we wouldn't have had the Second World War. They could have been the hegemon, the peace enforcer, Pax Americana. They could have supported the international financial system, right? They could have fixed everything, but weren't ready, weren't up to the task, shrank from the task, and a contributing factor also. Whether you take that argument or not, the Second World War problem is clearly going to draw American power. It's going to draw American power, reluctantly or willingly, into the picture. You've got the Japanese story, which is going to be a direct attack. We can argue about the extent to which America helped provoke that attack on Japan, but that showdown in East Asia, and then the showdown in Europe over the Hitler peace, which is also going to draw the United States in. Right? So it's hard for me even to see, the U.S. not becoming a global power. It's hard for me to see us having a U.S. which looks like 1900 or 1910 or even 1925 or 1935 compared to the U.S. we see today. So the only piece that, therefore, I could see this scenario not playing out is to go back to 1917, and remove some things that happened. And so this is where the lecture 1917 maybe has some punch. So one can then talk about the things that happened in 1917, and if they didn't happen, what might be the consequences. Germany doesn't put Lenin on the train and let him go back to Russia. Think about that. Germany doesn't conduct the submarine warfare, the unrestricted submarine warfare, and doesn't provoke the U.S. entry into the war. And therefore, Germany doesn't lose the war on the Western Front. Right? The Kerensky government doesn't push for an offensive in June 1917, after the downfall of the Tsar, when all the soldiers think the war should be over, and they're beginning to leave the front. And Kerensky instead enforces an offensive on the Russians with the Russian army, which is disastrous, right? So we begin to see contingencies written in to the 1917 story. The gambles that Germany takes, the actions that happen in Russia, the failures of the political class in Russia. We could talk about the provisional government and its failures, right, which happens just between March 1917 and October 1917. We can talk about how Lenin could have been prevented, how the Mensheviks might not have walked out, for example, of the Soviet, how the Constituent Assembly in January 1918 might have been defended by the SRs. And there's all sorts of fantastic contingencies that don't give you success of socialism and German defeat in the First World War. And that then pulls the thread, it takes the sweater away. You pull some of those threads and then you don't get the structural situation that you've gotten now. So contingency is a really big deal, but those things happened. And it produced the structures that we have. And those structures that we have are very, very vast. They're like big tectonic plates moving. And those tectonic plates, those moving, to stop them, right? Think about it. What would you have done if you had been Chamberlain? Think about the dilemma that he now faced. Part of it is his own causing, I agree. Right? So once these structures are put in place, the Second World War, the rise of US power, right? So this 1917 is a hinge moment in some ways, not exactly the way that we've always thought about it. At least that's what I'd like to argue in today's lecture. Thank you very much for your time.
There's time for questions. Please just raise your hands.
Do I call on them or do you call on them?
I think you're a skilled lecturer. You can call.
Well, I don't know the people's names though, so.
Well, that
yes, sir.
makes it easier for you.
You're next.
Okay, so what would you have done had you been chosen?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? I like that question. So the answer is, Chamberlain had a policy of deterrence and appeasement. Appeasement meant just negotiation, conciliation. And deterrence meant build a bomber fleet, build a navy up. The problem is that they didn't feel that they could afford the deterrence because it was too costly, it would bankrupt them. After all, this is the Great Depression. There's fragility in the British economy. And so the deterrent piece was left out or de-emphasized, which made the conciliation piece even more conciliatory than it would have been. So in dealing with the Hitler question, you had to have both the negotiation but also the deterrence. We often go into negotiations, even America today, which is a superpower, without sufficient deterrence. And people talk about how Trump is crazy, dumb, he's provoking potential global war when he talks about a military option, right? But if you don't talk about a military option when you have one, and you go into a negotiation, and they don't believe you have a military option, it's not going to be an easy negotiation, is it? So if Hitler doesn't feel that the wrath of British bombers, the wrath of the Royal Air Force, is legitimately going to rain down on him for behavior that he undertakes, right? So what happens, you know the Mussolini incident when Dollfuss, you know Dollfuss? He's the leader of Austria. And Hitler helps, not only, but the Nazi party in Germany helps instigate an attempted Nazi putsch in Austria in the mid-30s. And Dollfuss is close to Mussolini. Mussolini's not aligned with Hitler at this time. And Dollfuss is murdered in Vienna. And Dollfuss's family is Mussolini's guest at the time in Italy when the Nazis murder him in this attempted putsch. And Mussolini moves the Italian army up to the pass, ready to go, unless the Nazis back off the attempted putsch in Austria. And what does Hitler do? He backs off. He backs off. Mussolini is the only person who deters Hitler in the period 1933, right, onward. That's it. Now you say to yourself, Mussolini could deter Hitler? It seems improbable, doesn't it? Huh? First of all, we all associate Mussolini and Hitler as allies, but that doesn't happen until the Abyssinia, 1935 Abyssinian War, when Mussolini is critiqued for bombing and burning those villages in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, for Italian imperialism purposes, and then, of course, the Spanish Civil War, where they become much closer, right? But before that, Mussolini is not necessarily aligned with Hitler because Mussolini has interests in Austria that Hitler is impinging upon. So there's evidence from Mussolini, of all people, that Hitler is deterrable. So that's what you got to do. You got to actually move the armies. You got to bomb the bridges. You got to do stuff. You got to do stuff that shows that you're for real. And then when you go into the negotiation, you're not negotiating from a position of weakness. And also, if he doesn't keep his word, you're going to punish him. Right? So you need the deterrent, even though the deterrent aspect can be expensive. There's nothing wrong with negotiation, provided it's negotiation from strength. So, I mean, that option was on the table for Chamberlain. But once again, he wants to avoid the war. He wants to protect the empire. He feels precarious economic, and the whole country wants to avoid war. Who in Britain wants to fight? Like I said, the Labour Party is pro-appeasement. Almost all of the Tory party is pro-appeasement. There's only a minority in the Tory party that is worried about the Hitler thing. And the Foreign Office is also partly appeasement, and then the banking system is deeply engaged in appeasement also, right? But you need the deterrence aspect. It's the same thing today with North Korea. It's the same thing today with Iran. When they're afraid of you because they actually believe that there'll be consequences, that you have the wherewithal to smash them in the face, and they believe that, then you can negotiate from a different position, right? Once you hand Hitler Czechoslovakia, however, then you're really up the creek. See, because the Wehrmacht doesn't really exist before the takeover of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia has modern industry, modern army, mechanized divisions. The Škoda Works alone, one of the Škoda Works, which is the Czech side, not the Slovak side, and which Hitler gets for free with no compensation in the Munich Pact. And one of the things that Stalin does with Hitler is to make sure that Stalin's contracts with the Škoda Works are still fulfilled, even if the Munich Pact, because they're so valuable, the stuff. Right? That's really empowering to Hitler to grab that piece for free. It transforms the Wehrmacht. When they go into Austria, the Anschluss with Austria in March 38, this is by now Mussolini's on the other side and acquiesces in this. The German tanks run out of gas. They don't even have petrol to make it to Vienna. The German tanks are buying petrol on the roadside. And even then, a lot of tanks don't make it. But the French don't have a military attaché in Vienna at the time because the French governments are just toppling. There are so many French governments. They got no military attaché. Nobody sees the fiasco of the Wehrmacht in Austria in March 38. And they don't know that the Germans are really not for real yet. And so the failure to use deterrence as well as negotiation. Right? I mean, that's a longer story, and there are some details there, and it wasn't simple, because if it had been simple, he would have done it, right? The Churchill piece becomes also more complicated when you fit the facts into the story, which is something I do in this volume too. I think we had the gentleman up here.
Thank you. So were Italy and China at all players on the national stage, or were they really insignificant?
China and?
Italy.
Yeah, okay, so good question. The China story I left out. The China story is really big in another complicating factor, another structural problem that's going to give you momentum towards World War II. The China factor is there is not an imperialist takeover, not a colony. China's nobody's colony, but there's what we call informal imperialism, where outside powers dictate or some policies and impinge upon the sovereignty of China. The Soviet Union is one of them. The Soviet Union has created Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang to a very great extent. They're the ones bankrolling it. Stalin, for example, paid for the Chinese army, not the Red Army, not the communist Chinese army. Right, that's just ragtag guerrillas. You don't have to pay for that. He paid for the officer corps and the training of the Chiang Kai-shek Kuomintang, or nationalist China. And he continued to pay for that even after Chiang started slaughtering communists and going back on the deal and betraying Stalin. Stalin didn't betray Chiang. In fact, Chiang Kai-shek is taken hostage in the interior. And Stalin is the one who forbids Mao from executing Chiang Kai-shek. Otherwise, Chiang Kai-shek would have been gone long before. It's an incredible story that is also in Volume 2. If Stalin was only about vengeance, and Chiang Kai-shek had crossed him and betrayed him, and then Chiang was taken hostage in a plot by Chinese communists with one of the warlords from Manchuria, if Stalin had been only about vengeance, he would have been only too happy to allow Chiang to be executed. But instead, he forced them to back down and to release Chiang, which they did do. And in any case, so the Chinese story is a very big part of the story. It's got its own momentum and dynamism related to its revolution in 1911, you know, the fall of the dynasty, the attempt to create a republic, the Civil War, the warlords, the territories break off, the Soviet Union snatches Xinjiang, de facto, not formally doesn't annex it, but de facto was in control of that. The Japanese snatch Manchuria and create this puppet state, Manchukuo, right? So the Chinese are China is another very big complicating factor in the momentum towards war. Because the Japanese, like the Germans, have grandiose, unbelievably grandiose aspirations, which have to do with displacing China as the Middle Kingdom in East Asia, which requires the Japanese to garrison China. I don't know anybody who thinks that they can garrison China, given its size and population, but the Japanese think they can do that. So it's a good question. The Italy stuff, I could answer that too, but the short answer is yes. As I just pointed out, Mussolini is a big factor in switching from anti-Hitler to pro-Hitler, or constraining of Hitler to abetting of Hitler. And that changes the equation for the French, British, and the Soviets. Good question, thank you. We got any other questions? We're gonna go over there and then over here.
I think that World War I wasn't caused by sleepwalking.
Yeah.
But is it really possible that you find a British war plan and that is a decisive element when there are so many other plans, when the Germans were much better prepared to go to war and the British were really feebly prepared in terms of attacking Germany in any serious way?
Yeah, that's a big question. I get it that, you know, there's more that needs to be told for anybody to be persuaded about the view that I briefly laid out here about World War I. I get that. So the Germans are a land army, right? They're a land-based power. There's a land army. So if you're a land army, you look like you're more ready for a land war than if you're a sea power or a naval, an air power. Right? So the British are a naval power and an air power. So it doesn't look like they're ready for a continental war, whereas the Germans are a land power. In fact, one of the reasons why Hitler can't do the Channel invasion, but thinks he can do the Barbarossa invasion of the Soviet Union, he thinks he can do that because he's a land-based power. Right? German forces have a bias towards land forces. And the British are a sea and naval and air power, and so their ability to defend the Channel is much greater than their ability to fight a land war on the continent. They have not prepared to fight a land war on the continent. They have no intention of fighting a land war on the continent, but they are a very capable military power that can use this financial and economic leverage to defeat Germany, while also being able to defend themselves with the Navy and the Air Force, right? The Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, I wouldn't have traded the German Luftwaffe and the German Navy for the British one, never. But then again, it's a land-based power. So once you factor that in, once you understand that the reason Germany looks like it's ready to fight a land war is because Germany is a land power ready to fight a land war, right? And so I'm not saying Germany's not culpable. They're obviously culpable, right? They give the blank check to Austria-Hungary. You know, that old saw is actually true. And the Germans look to gain. They perceive strategic advantage in the outbreak of war. They think that their troops actually need the exercise. They need to harden their people and harden their army by combat experience. I mean, you know, state prestige is on the line, territorial gain. There's a calculus on the German side, which is pro-war. There also is a calculus about how Russia is gaining in strength and is never going to be as weak as it is. This is a perennial thing about attacking Russia, right? The Hitler would say the same thing, that Russia may look weak now, but if we wait, it's going to be too strong. So we got to do preventive war right now. The Germans make that argument in 1914, and Hitler makes that argument again in 1940-41. All right? So this is, I meant to imply nothing about an absence of German culpability or preparation. I only meant to imply that a lot of people were prepared for war. And the reason there was war was because there was a strategic calculus that war could deliver gains. And that is true across the belligerents without making all the belligerents equally responsible or culpable. That's not an argument I need to engage in right now. My only argument is that World War I is the product of the system that I've described and not some kind of freak that could have been easily prevented. Like, you know, this crazy assassination of the Habsburg heir in Sarajevo, right? Well, let's think about that for a second. He goes to Sarajevo, right? They've annexed Bosnia. The Habsburgs have annexed Bosnia. And he goes to Sarajevo on Vidovdan, the Serbian national holiday. That's the day they pick on purpose to go there. So it's not as if they're innocent. It's a provocation. It's a provocation organized by the Bosnian governor. And of course, the Habsburg heir, the Archduke, is complicit in this because he's agreed to do this. And so once again, you know, it's not like there's some kind of accident over there. There were decisions that were taken, and those were provocative decisions. And then there were additional provocative decisions that were taken in consequence of that original provocative decision. But the table had been set already. They weren't chain-ganged into the war because they had a bad alliance system and you need to avoid alliances, right? They had been doing nothing but preparing for war. And then the war came, and they fought it. And then they said, oh, this is not what we expected. We didn't expect millions of people to die for no reason. No territorial gain, stalemate, trenches. Right? That wasn't part of the plan. So that's when the aversion to war kicks in. But the aversion to war is not really predominant prior to 1914. It's quite the opposite. And that's true on the British side, but that doesn't mean that I'm making the British responsible for the war. Okay, I think we had over here. Yeah.
Easy one for you. In 2017, in 2017, with 2 nuclear superpowers and 7 other nuclear powers, what are the geopolitical factors that you see adding to the danger of war, of war implicating those nuclear weapons, and which ones do you see as retarding that danger?
Yeah. Yeah, that was very simple. I agree with you. Yeah. And it's perfect just before the 6-hour car ride back to Princeton. Because on that car ride, I could maybe think of an answer. But right now, I got 3 minutes to think of an answer. So World War II was incredible. You thought World War I was a big deal? World War I turned out to be a fairy tale. Right? A little nothing, a short story compared to the novel of World War II. You got 55 million dead in World War II. 55 million. I mean, I can't even, what does that mean, 55 million? Half of that is the Soviet Union, and they won. You got another 10 to 13 million is China. They were on the winning side too. So you got 40 million between the Soviet Union and China dead. You got a couple million in India, and they're not even in the textbooks. Right? And then you got things, you know, like Mengele and the Holocaust and the Japanese biological program, and it's just, you can't believe this, even though you know it's true, and you read it again, and it still is unfathomable. But it happened. But it hasn't been repeated. Right? The first one, they didn't want a second one, then they got the second one because they put all these structures in place to get a second one. While hoping to avoid it, they were nonetheless stepping on the gas, sometimes without realizing it. Right? But now with the second one, it's maybe one too many. And the realization after the second one that the first one was a mistake and the second one was even a bigger mistake changes the picture. You get, of course, you get the United States drawn into the picture, and you get the Europeans and the Japanese understanding that they're culpable and wanting to move beyond it. Okay, it's reluctant, it's difficult, but nonetheless, the achievement of West Germany and Japan post-World War II is astonishing what they became. Gigantic, free economies, free societies, democratic rule of law. I mean, this is Nazi Germany and Hirohito's Japan. So it astonishes me to see what happens. So that's a really big, great story. After the catastrophe, on top of the catastrophe, we get to a better place. Now, it doesn't look like a better place everywhere. You know, if you were in Afghanistan, you were in Vietnam, you were in the Congo, and we could go on, right? I mean, there are 100+ wars, real wars, during the Cold War. Yeah, 100+ real wars during the Cold War. So it is not exactly a peaceful time, but there are no great power wars. Because the great power wars, those are the problems, right? It's a big problem in Vietnam when there's a war, don't get me wrong. But when there's a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, which have nuclear weapons, that's a different order of magnitude problem. And we don't have that. So that's a great story, and we have to figure out how to tell that story. And then it turns out that the Soviet Union, which won the Second World War, literally, loses the peace. It loses the peace, and it retreats along the same roads as Napoleon, but only in the opposite direction. 650,000 troops, including 400,000 troops from Germany, go home. And they lose all that territory that dates from Peter the Great onward. All that fantastic frontage, that great real estate that they've got in Europe, let alone the satellite stuff. We're talking about just the home territory. So they lose the peace. That's a really big loss. It was built into the nature of their regime. It was built into the world system and American power, and there's sort of, once again, there's a structural determinant to this. It wasn't like they just turned left when they should have turned right, or they did that earlier. But they were structurally determined that they were on the losing side of the peace. So we came out of them losing the peace relatively okay. Right? I'm still here to try to, or fail to answer your question. Right? And I actually think that that's improbable, given the arsenal that the Soviet Union possessed, given the nature of that regime, given our understanding of that regime, and given how big imperial ventures go down usually. They don't go down saying, okay, we lost, we're done, we'll go home. In fact, we'll go to a smaller home. They say, you're coming down with me. We're all coming down together out of spite. Right? They don't do that. So that's a really big deal. We have to appreciate that. So we have this fantastic story with caveats of post-World War II. And then we have the Soviets losing the peace mostly peacefully. That's a wow. That's another wow. And now we have the world we have today. And the problem with the world we have today is, in part, cable TV. Right? It's cable TV. Now, you're smart people. I'm going to venture that everybody in this room is a smart person. And I'm also going to venture that you watch CNN. Some of you do. Some of you willingly turn it on. Like, for example, if you were under torture, if you were handcuffed and they turned it on, that would be, I would understand that. That would be something that not of your own volition. But you stand there and you turn it on and you sit there and watch it. Okay, so we have a problem which is both what the world actually looks like and how we perceive the world. And the relationship between what the world looks like and what the opportunities and the dangers are, to the perception of that, has shifted radically. And it's shifted radically because of this 24/7 problem. Can you imagine cable TV during the early years of the Cold War, the Berlin crisis? Can you imagine cable TV in the Cuban Missile Crisis? And I could go on, right? It's a very significant factor now that it wasn't before. I'm not saying that it's all lies and all wrong. Some of it is good. I'm just saying that it's changed now how we're able to understand what's out there and what's going on, and how we're able to measure threats and measure responses. Is the world more dangerous today than it was when the Soviet Union and the United States could have annihilated the planet many times over? I wonder if that's actually true. The perception, the cable TV perception, is that it's more uncertain now, more dangerous now than ever, don't know what to do, more difficult to manage. And frankly, I don't know what's more difficult than the Soviet Union necessarily, with the possibility of nuclear Armageddon, chemical and biological warfare, and all of that kind of stuff. So that's an important question. I'm not necessarily going to give you the detailed empirical answer that you're looking for. I'd just like to, point out that it's harder to discuss now than before. It's harder to understand whether perception is driving, whether news cycle and business model of cable TV is driving this, and whether over-bureaucratization. To win the Cold War, we had to create a massive security bureaucracy. And that massive security bureaucracy is now a hindrance on our ability to be nimble, responsive, clever, strategic, right? We somehow occupied Japan and Germany simultaneously. Can you imagine? We occupied Japan and Germany simultaneously, and we didn't even have a national security bureaucracy yet. And the Pentagon didn't have civilians yet. The Pentagon didn't really have civilians to a great extent until the Vietnam War, which just burst the door open and made the Pentagon this giant civilian bureaucracy in addition to a military bureaucracy. So we have some things which are difficult in the way to understand the world that we live in. My understanding of the world that we live in now is that this is going to be primitive, but then again, you've been here for an hour and a half, so you're not going to be surprised. This is going to be very primitive. But my understanding of the world that we have today is we don't know if the Chinese thing is resilient or not, because the Chinese haven't had a massive crisis yet. We know the US is resilient. The institutions are really strong. The economy is unbelievably dynamic and strong. We had the global financial crisis, and here we are on the other side of it. And you could say there was injustice, you could say there were a lot of bad things, but it didn't destroy the system. The Chinese and the Russians both expected the global financial crisis to be the end of the West and the end of American power. They were gloating about it, and they were planning as if that was it. But it didn't turn out to be the case. And the Trump thing was Armageddon, except, you look at the Trump thing, and the system is pretty incredibly responsive. There's a lot going on in the American system to show you that the American system, for all its flaws, and we could talk about its flaws, till we're blue in the face, also has some advantages. I don't know about the Chinese system. So your understanding of the world now it pivots absolutely on your understanding of the degree of resilience or not in the Chinese system when a crisis hits. We project Chinese power going forward. When are the Chinese going to have the bigger economy? When are the Chinese going to have the bigger navy? Yada, yada, yada. The Chinese system could be very fragile. When a crisis hits, a very significant crisis, which will be unforeseen until the next day after the crisis, when everyone will have predicted the crisis on CNN or MSNBC. I don't want to be partisan here. Right? If you watch Red Army TV, fine. Right? That's fine by me. But I'm just saying, I didn't want to single out CNN necessarily, but I'm just saying that the Chinese could go down. That whole thing could be a house of cards. Or it could be incredibly resilient in ways that we don't understand, in which case those projections forward make sense. So you tell me what you think about the Chinese resilience problem. It's the old thing about the tide going out, and then you see who's naked or not, right? That famous expression. That's the thing with a crisis. Or as we say in New York, all doctors are good until you get sick. And as soon as you get sick, it's like, oh my God, this doctor can't diagnose what my problem is. It's not a very good doctor. We had great conversations, great bedside manner, fantastic, person, great medical school, and now I actually need a doctor for a problem, for the crisis that's hit, and the doctor doesn't work, right? There are different problems with doctors in New York. If a doctor is willing to take you on as a patient, you don't want to go there. The only doctors you want to see are the ones that have no appointments left, because those are the ones that have, that's a separate. But so the Chinese piece, Chinese resilience. The Chinese experts, the scholars of China, are on both sides of the fence on this resilience question. You can read Foreign Affairs and think that the great magazine, which brings together alternative points of view, and you can think that the system is strong and going to endure. Or you can think that the Chinese system is this house of cards and very fragile. So until we know the answer to that, the world today is very difficult to navigate and understand. Because if the Chinese are a house of cards, all you got to do is blow a little bit on it, or you just stay and watch on the outside and let it tumble, right? But if the Chinese are resilient, if that system is here for good, if they're on a run that's going to be a multi-century run, then you need a whole different strategy from the one you're playing out, or you're on a capitulation game without fully understanding that you're in the capitulation game, right? So there are other issues that one could discuss, the Russia piece, the Middle East, and Washington itself, and all of that kind of stuff. But my view is that everything pivots on your belief or not in the resilience of the Chinese system. Anyway, are we good? Thank you for your attention.